I need to see your identification, ma'am.
I am a US citizen. Why are you asking?
We need to verify the information.
This feels like harassment. I'm just doing my job.
In the middle of a routine workday, beneath fluorescent lights and the quiet rhythm of prescription orders, a federal immigration agent stepped into a neighborhood pharmacy and demanded compliance without presenting a warrant. Behind the counter stood a licensed pharmacist, a United States citizen, responsible for patient safety and regulated medications. Within minutes, her professional authority was overshadowed by federal force. She did not resist. She did not raise her voice. She asked for documentation. She asked for lawful justification. What she received instead was escalation. Assertions of power without visible proof. Customers waiting for medication became witnesses. Employees froze between fear and disbelief. Surveillance cameras captured every movement. What unfolded was not a chaotic misunderstanding, but a visible test of due process inside a private workplace. A healthcare professional was treated as a suspect in front of her own community, without a warrant and without clear cause. The confrontation would trigger legal scrutiny, expose procedural failures, and ultimately lead to a financial settlement large enough to command national attention. But before accountability came humiliation, uncertainty, and a question that extends far beyond one pharmacy. What protects ordinary citizens when authority bypasses its own rules? The moment the agent reached across the pharmacy counter, the room changed. Customers who had been waiting quietly for prescriptions stepped back. A technician froze with a pill bottle still in her hand. Behind the counter stood a licensed pharmacist in a white coat, her name stitched neatly over her pocket. Minutes earlier, she had been checking dosages and answering routine questions about side effects. Now she was facing a federal immigration agent demanding to detain her. He identified himself as an officer with Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Then he did not present a warrant. He did not show a court order signed by a judge. Instead, he spoke with firm authority and instructed her to step away from her station. The pharmacist remained calm. She explained that she was a United States citizen. She said she had documentation in her office. She asked to see legal paperwork authorizing the detention. Her voice stayed steady, but her hands tightened around the edge of the counter. The pharmacy was small. Shelves lined the walls. Security cameras were mounted near the ceiling, recording every angle of the room. Two elderly customers waiting for blood pressure medication watched silently. A mother holding a toddler shifted nervously near the greeting cards display. Employees glanced at each other, unsure whether to intervene or stay still. The agent moved around the counter. The physical barrier between them disappeared. He repeated his order. The pharmacist stepped back, confused but composed. She had opened the store that morning as she always did. She had checked inventory, reviewed prescriptions, and greeted regular patients by name. Nothing about the day had suggested it would end with federal enforcement in her workplace. One technician quietly reached for her phone. Another stared at the surveillance monitor in the corner office, where the live feed showed the agent standing close behind their supervisor. The power imbalance was clear. Then he carried a badge and the weight of federal authority. She carried a license and the trust of her community. When he took hold of her arm to guide her away from the counter, the room fell silent. Patients who had come for routine medication were now witnesses to a detention unfolding in plain view. No warrant had been shown. No clear explanation had been given. The pharmacy, a place built on order and care, had become the setting of an unexpected and deeply public confrontation. Before that afternoon, her life followed a steady and predictable rhythm. She arrived at the pharmacy before opening each morning, usually with coffee in hand and a printed list of pending prescriptions. She reviewed orders, checked expiration dates, and prepared the day's workflow for her small team. Her white coat was always pressed. Her license was displayed on the wall behind the counter, framed beside her pharmacy degree. She had completed years of higher education and clinical training to earn that license. She passed national board exams. She maintained continuing education credits every year, as required by law. Her professional record showed no disciplinary actions, no complaints, no criminal history. She was not only legally authorized to work in the United States, She was born here and carried full citizenship documentation. Patients trusted her with sensitive information. Many were elderly and relied on her to explain complex medication schedules. Parents asked her about antibiotic dosages for their children. She understood that a pharmacist's role required accuracy, discretion, and steady judgment. Mistakes could harm people. That responsibility shaped her daily routine. Outside of work, her life was equally ordinary. She paid a mortgage. She filed taxes. She voted in elections. She visited family on weekends and attended community events. Nothing in her background suggested risk or suspicion. Her citizenship was not a question she expected to defend inside her own workplace. The pharmacy itself served as a neighborhood anchor. Regular customers greeted her by name. Staff members described her as patient and detail-oriented. She trained technicians carefully and emphasized compliance with state and federal regulations. Inspections from health authorities had always been routine and uneventful, and that is why the accusation implied by the agent's actions felt so destabilizing. Being approached by federal immigration enforcement suggested doubt about her legal status. The implication alone carried weight. In a healthcare setting, reputation matters. Trust is fragile. A visible detention can plant uncertainty in the minds of patients, even when no wrongdoing exists. As news of the incident began to circulate among employees and close contacts, those who knew her struggled to reconcile the image of a dedicated pharmacist with the image of a federal officer guiding her away from her own counter. The contrast between her documented credentials and the treatment she received deepened the sense that something had gone seriously wrong. Inside the pharmacy, the rules were usually clear. Health inspectors needed proper identification. Law enforcement officers needed legal authority to search private areas. The counter separated public space from a restricted work zone where medications were stored and patient records were protected. Access was controlled for safety and privacy. Federal immigration agents also operate under rules. In most cases, to enter non-public areas of a business or detain someone inside, they must present a warrant signed by a judge. This type of warrant shows that a court has reviewed evidence and found legal grounds for action. An administrative document signed within an agency is different. It does not carry the same authority as a judicial warrant. According to surveillance footage and employee statements, no judicial warrant was shown that afternoon. The agent identified himself and asserted his authority, but he did not provide paperwork signed by a judge authorizing entry behind the counter or detention of the pharmacist. When she asked to see documentation, none was presented in view of staff or customers, and the distinction mattered. A pharmacy is not an open public square. Behind the counter are controlled medications, confidential health files, and regulated substances. Federal and state laws strictly limit who may enter that space. By stepping around the counter without visible court authorization, the agent crossed from public retail area into restricted professional territory. Witnesses later described feeling confused. Some assumed that a federal officer must have automatic authority to act. Others sensed hesitation in the exchange. The pharmacist's repeated request for documentation suggested she understood her rights. She was not refusing cooperation without reason. She was asking for proof that the detention followed legal procedure. The power imbalance was difficult to ignore. The agent wore official insignia and carried the weight of federal enforcement. The pharmacist wore a name badge and a state license. In that moment, it was unclear whether legal safeguards would be respected or overridden by the assertion of authority alone. As the agent maintained his position behind the counter and directed her away from her workstation, the absence of visible judicial authorization became the silent center of the conflict. Procedure, which normally protects both citizens and officers, appeared to have been set aside in plain view of everyone watching. In a pharmacy, privacy is expected. Patients discuss medical conditions in low voices. Prescription labels are handled with care. The environment is designed to protect trust. That afternoon, that sense of protection fractured in full view of the public. As the agent positioned himself behind the counter, customers instinctively stepped aside. Some stared openly. Others looked down at their phones, unsure where to focus. A technician who had been counting tablets slowly placed the tray on the counter and moved back. The routine hum of printers and barcode scanners felt unusually loud in the silence. The pharmacist stood upright, but her posture had changed. Her shoulders were tense. She had always been the authority in this space. She verified prescriptions. She corrected errors. She ensured compliance. Now, in front of patients who depended on her judgment, she appeared subject to suspicion. A customer near the register lifted a phone discreetly, recording. Another glanced up at the ceiling cameras, as if aware that the entire scene was being captured from above. The surveillance system had been installed for theft prevention and safety. On that day, it became a record of something far more serious. Employees later described feeling exposed. They did not know whether they were required to assist the agent. They did not know whether refusing entry behind the counter would be considered obstruction. Their training focused on healthcare regulations, not immigration enforcement, so a fear of doing the wrong thing kept most of them silent. The humiliation was quiet, but unmistakable. No raised voices were needed. The act of being guided away from the counter, in front of waiting patients, suggested wrongdoing, even without formal accusation. In a healthcare setting, reputation is built slowly, but can be damaged instantly. The pharmacy had always represented stability. Elderly customers relied on familiar faces. Parents trusted careful dosing instructions. In a matter of minutes, that stability was replaced by uncertainty. The professional boundary between caregiver and patient dissolved under the weight of federal authority exercised without visible documentation. Once outside the pharmacy, the atmosphere shifted from public embarrassment to controlled isolation. The agent escorted her to a government vehicle parked near the entrance. Neighbors walking past slowed down, noticing the uniform and badge. Some recognized her and watched with visible confusion. She was placed in the vehicle for questioning. The process was procedural but firm. She again stated that she was a United States citizen. She explained that her identification and documents were available. She asked why she was being detained. Clear answers were not provided in that moment. Inside the pharmacy, employees stood still for several seconds after the door closed. Then, the reality of the situation set in. Customers began asking whether the store would remain open. Prescriptions were mid-process. Refrigerated medications required monitoring. One technician called the pharmacy's corporate contact for guidance. Another attempted to reach the pharmacist's emergency contact information. Word spread quickly through text messages and phone calls. Family members learned that she had been taken away by immigration enforcement, despite being a citizen. The emotional impact moved fast. Fear turned into disbelief. Disbelief turned into urgency as legal assistance was sought. The pharmacy closed early that day. A printed sign was taped to the front door explaining that operations were temporarily suspended. For patients relying on critical medications, the interruption caused stress and inconvenience. Staff members worried about payroll, about compliance, and about their own security. During detention, her personal and professional identity felt suspended. She had entered work that morning as a licensed healthcare provider. By afternoon, she was being treated as though her legal status was uncertain. No charges were filed at that time. No clear explanation justified the disruption. By the end of the day, she was released, but the questions remained. The emotional strain lingered. Her return home was quiet, marked not by relief alone, but by concern over what the incident would mean for her reputation, her business, SARS, and her standing in the community. In the days that followed, the focus shifted from memory to evidence. The pharmacy's surveillance system had recorded the entire encounter from multiple angles. The cameras captured the agent entering the store, identifying himself, and moving behind the counter. They captured the pharmacist standing still, hands visible, asking to see documentation. They captured the absence of any paper warrant being presented in view of staff or customers. An attorney reviewed the footage carefully. Frame by frame, the timeline became clear. The pharmacist did not resist. She did not attempt to flee. Her requests were calm and consistent. The agent's decision to step into the restricted workspace was visible and uninterrupted. The moment he guided her away from the counter was documented without obstruction. Employees provided written statements that matched the video record. Customers who had filmed portions on their phones shared short clips online. Though incomplete, those clips reinforced what the surveillance system showed: a detention carried out without visible judicial authorization. Local media outlets began requesting access to the footage. When segments aired, viewers could see the controlled environment of the pharmacy and the steady posture of the pharmacist. The recordings removed ambiguity. What might have been dismissed as misunderstanding now appeared procedural and deliberate. Public perception shifted. The issue was no longer simply whether an officer had authority. The question became whether that authority had been exercised according to law. The visual evidence forced attention on the distinction between assertion and proof. For the pharmacist, the footage served two purposes. It confirmed her account and protected her credibility. It also intensified scrutiny of the agency's actions. What happened inside a small neighborhood pharmacy was no longer private. It was documented, reviewable, and increasingly difficult to ignore. With the footage preserved and reviewed, legal action became the next step. Civil rights attorneys agreed to represent her after examining the recordings and written statements from employees and customers. They concluded that the detention may have violated constitutional protections against unreasonable seizure. In simple terms, the Fourth Amendment protects people from being detained without proper legal justification. The lawsuit filed in federal court alleged unlawful detention, violation of civil rights, emotional distress, and damage to professional reputation. It stated that no judicial warrant had been presented before the agent entered the restricted workspace or escorted her from the pharmacy. It described the public nature of the incident and the impact on her business operations. Attorneys also detailed financial harm. The pharmacy had closed temporarily. Patients transferred prescriptions to other locations during the disruption. Revenue declined in the weeks following the incident. Staff hours were reduced. Beyond financial loss, the complaint emphasized the reputational damage caused by being publicly treated as a suspected immigration violator despite documented citizenship. The federal agency issued a brief public statement acknowledging the lawsuit, but declining to comment on specifics while the case was pending. Internally, reports were requested and reviewed. The agent's training records and operational guidelines were examined. Legal analysts began discussing the broader implications. Workplace enforcement actions must follow clear procedures. Entering non-public areas of a business generally requires a judicial warrant signed by a judge. The distinction between internal administrative paperwork and court authorization became central to the case. As filings moved through the court system, the power dynamic shifted. What began as a one-sided assertion of authority inside a pharmacy was now subject to judicial oversight. Evidence would be reviewed under oath. Some policies would be examined against constitutional standards. The confrontation that unfolded in minutes would now be measured carefully in a courtroom. As the case moved into discovery, both sides were required to exchange information. This stage of a lawsuit is designed to uncover facts before trial. Depositions were scheduled. Under oath, the agent was questioned about his decision to enter the pharmacy and detain the pharmacist. He was asked what information he relied on and whether he had obtained a warrant signed by a judge. Training manuals and internal guidelines were requested. Attorneys examined whether agency policy required judicial authorization before entering non-public business areas. They reviewed communication logs to determine if supervisors had approved the action in advance. Each document was measured against the timeline captured on surveillance video. The footage remained central. In a courtroom setting, it was played slowly and carefully. The judge and attorneys observed the agent's movement behind the counter and the pharmacist's consistent request for documentation. The absence of a visible warrant was again noted. What had unfolded quickly in real time was now studied, frame by frame. The pharmacist also gave sworn testimony. She described the confusion she felt when federal authority appeared in her workplace without warning. She explained how the public nature of the detention affected her reputation and the trust of her patients. Her account aligned with the recorded evidence. Through this process, the balance of power continued to shift. Assertions were no longer enough. Decisions had to be justified with documentation and policy references. The court's role was not to debate immigration enforcement broadly, but to determine whether this specific action respected constitutional limits. Institutional scrutiny extended beyond the individual agent. Supervisory procedures, communication chains, and compliance training were all examined. The case had moved from a single confrontation inside a pharmacy to a formal evaluation of how authority was exercised and whether established safeguards had been followed. As the case approached trial, negotiations began. Civil cases often resolve before a jury is seated. Both sides weigh risk, cost, and public exposure. In this situation, the evidence was clear and recorded. The surveillance footage, employee statements, and sworn depositions formed a consistent record. The question was no longer whether the detention occurred, but whether it could be justified under constitutional standards. After months of legal exchanges, a settlement was reached. The federal government agreed to pay $1.2 million to resolve the lawsuit. The agreement did not require a formal admission of wrongdoing. That is common in civil settlements. However, the size of the payment reflected recognition of the potential liability and the strength of the documented evidence. The compensation addressed several categories of harm. It included lost business revenue during the closure and decline in customer traffic. It accounted for legal fees and the financial strain of prolonged litigation. It also recognized emotional distress and reputational damage caused by the public detention. Beyond the payment, the resolution prompted internal review. Agency officials reassessed procedures related to workplace enforcement and warrant requirements. Training updates were reportedly discussed to clarify entry into restricted business areas and the presentation of judicial authorization. For the pharmacist, the settlement marked legal vindication. A federal court filing now recorded that her detention had triggered substantial compensation. The event that began with uncertainty inside a small pharmacy had ended with measurable accountability. The outcome did not erase the experience, but it confirmed that constitutional protections carry weight. Authority exercised without proper documentation can lead to real consequences, even when carried out by federal officers. After the settlement became public, the reaction extended far beyond the pharmacy's walls. Local news outlets revisited the original footage. Legal experts discussed the case in the context of workplace enforcement and constitutional limits. Community members who had once watched the detention in silence now spoke openly about what they had witnessed. Professional associations for pharmacists expressed concern about federal entry into healthcare spaces without visible judicial warrants. Pharmacies are regulated environments where privacy and safety are tightly controlled. The case was cited in discussions about how enforcement actions should be conducted in businesses that handle sensitive medical information. Within the neighborhood, support for the pharmacist became visible. Customers returned with messages of encouragement. Some said they had transferred prescriptions elsewhere during the uncertainty, but chose to come back after learning the full facts. Trust, once shaken, began to rebuild slowly. Advocacy groups focused on civil liberties pointed to the case as an example of how documentation and video evidence can shape accountability, and they emphasized that constitutional protections apply in everyday settings, not only in dramatic encounters. The settlement amount reinforced that violations of due process carry financial consequences. Inside the pharmacy, operations stabilized, staff schedules returned to normal. Inspections and regulatory reviews continued as they always had. The framed license remained on the wall, unchanged, but now carrying deeper meaning. For the pharmacist, the experience left a lasting mark. She resumed her routine, checking prescriptions, counseling patients, managing inventory, but with heightened awareness of how quickly authority can disrupt ordinary life. The legal resolution provided closure, yet the memory of being escorted away from her own counter remained clear. The case entered public record as a reminder that procedure matters. When safeguards are bypassed, even briefly, the effects ripple outward. Accountability may take time, but evidence, persistence, and lawful process can restore balance.